Good morning to you. This is Sky News Breakfast, where it's 7 o'clock in the UK, 9 o'clock here in Kiev, as Ukraine's armed forces fight to save their country from Russian aggression. Russia's offensive against Ukraine enters its second day with more explosions here in the capital, Kiev. This is the scene as day breaks on the capital this morning, with the Ukrainian government saying 137 civilians and military personnel have been killed. Sirens sound across Kiev for a second morning in a row as the threat of Russian air raids continues. A call to arms, Ukraine's president orders a full military mobilization, with 18 to 60-year-old men banned from leaving this country.
What Ukrainians should do: help the national defense, join the national armed forces, anyone with experience in the army. It's really important.
Penalties for the pariah president, a raft of fresh sanctions imposed from the West, but Ukraine claim they have been left to fight alone. Anger at the invasion, more than 1,700 arrested on possible treason charges as anti-war protests take place in more than 50 Russian cities. We will have the latest throughout the morning from here in Kiev, as well as Moscow, London, Brussels, and the United States. So, good morning. Welcome to Sky News Breakfast live from Kiev. We've been left alone to fight Russia. That's the message from Ukraine's president as his forces continue to battle Vladimir Putin's invasion. As the Russian offensive enters its second day here, Putin's forces are advancing from the north, the east and the south, and the capital, Kiev, is now under direct threat. There have been more rocket attacks in Kiev, with many people spending the night in underground shelters here. In the last hour, the International Criminal Court said it may investigate possible war crimes committed by Russia. These are the latest developments so far. In the past couple of hours, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced that Russian strikes on his country resumed this morning at 4 a.m. local time, aimed at both military and civilian targets. The president has ordered a full military mobilization to counter the Russian invasion. Men aged 18 to 60 are now banned from leaving this country. He says that so far 137 people have been killed, describing them as heroes. President Zelensky also stated the number of wounded as 316. Russian forces are believed to have taken the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Our international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn has this report.
A huge explosion lights up Kiev. The fighting reaching the skies above the Ukrainian capital. On the ground, residential buildings have been hit. In the east of the country, Ukrainians race to the shelters in the city of Mariupol under attack from Russia. Above ground, they try and contain the damage done by shelling to their property and families.
I don't worry about myself, I worry about children. They wake up and they cry, asking, "What happened, Mom?" What do I say to him? The war? He doesn't get it at all. He asks, "What should I do?"
This is thought to be Hostomel airport just outside of Kiev, taken by Russian special forces, then reportedly retaken by Ukrainians. Ukraine's president addressed his nation last night, accusing Russia of wanting to decapitate his government.
I remain in the capital. My family is also in Ukraine. My children are in Ukraine. My family are not traitors. They are citizens of Ukraine. Where exactly they are, I have no right to say. According to the information we have, the enemy has marked me as target number 1, my family as target number 2. They want to damage Ukraine politically by destroying the head of state.
Ukraine's Ministry of Defence claims its forces have mounted stiff resistance to Russia's attacks, but Russia has captured key sites, including Chernobyl.
Sadly, I have to inform you that as of now, the Chernobyl zone, the so-called Chernobyl exclusion zone, and all the structures of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant are under the control of the Russian armed groups. According to the management of the Chernobyl exclusion zone and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, there have been no casualties. The information will be updated.
Russia claims it's defending people here in separatist-controlled eastern parts of Ukraine. There has been shelling here with casualties.
In around 3 minutes, another shell came here, right into the factory workshop, and those people were hit who didn't have time to hide.
But Russia's launched far more than a defensive operation, a massive, multi-pronged invasion across Ukraine's borders, raising the prospect of Europe's biggest land war since World War II. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Moscow.
And we're joined now by the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Thank you very much for being with us. We were woken this morning here by loud explosions. Is it your view that the Russians are intent on taking this city and removing President Zelensky from power?
It's definitely our view that the Russians intend to invade the whole of Ukraine. The nonsense they were spouting about the Donbass, and it were, you know, as ever with a whole series of dishonest claims, are not the case, and that's why you've seen a number of columns of Russian army entering the city from the south, from the north, from Belarus even, and indeed from the separatist region. But, you know, our assessment as of this morning is that Russia has not taken any of its major objectives. In fact, it is behind its hoped-for timetable. They've lost over 450 personnel. And indeed, as you've said on your report, one of the significant airports they were trying to capture with their elite Spetsnaz has failed to be taken. And in fact, the Ukrainians have taken it back. So I think, contrary to great Russian claims, and indeed President Putin's sort of vision that somehow the Ukrainians would be liberated and would be flocking to his cause, he's got that completely wrong. And the Russian army has failed to deliver on day one its main objective.
Even so, I mean, the explosions this morning are getting closer. We're told Russian forces are making their way here, albeit with some resistance. If they do topple this government, do you accept that the West has failed Ukraine?
Well, what I have said all along is that Ukraine needs its support and allies. The United Kingdom, Sweden, for example, Canada, and a number of other countries have stood side by side with Ukraine since 2014. We had Operation Orbital to help set up and train. We trained over 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers. We were the first country to deploy lethal aid to help the Ukrainians in Europe alongside the United States. And now we're joined by 4 or 5 other European countries, I'm pleased to say. But, you know, the person who has failed to live up to all his agreements, including the agreements that he has signed as lately as 2010, or certainly the Russian Federation, has been President Putin. He's failed to follow international law. He's failed to respect human rights and democracy.
But with respect. No, with respect. I mean, the West has failed to persuade President Putin that the price of invasion is too high.
I wrote an article in January that President Putin was beyond this type of persuasion. You know, President Putin, I said, and got criticised at the time, there was a whiff of Munich about President Putin, and it wasn't about the bit about appeasement I was referring to. I was referring that in the Munich in 1938, Adolf Hitler all along had a plan to invade parts of Europe, and all the diplomacy was about a straw man sort of attempt by him to buy time. Putin has been set on this for many, many months and certainly over a year. And I think that's why, you know, it doesn't matter how much effort we made, and we all made unbelievable amounts of effort. We saw President Macron go with my Prime Minister, regularly spoke to Putin. Didn't matter. As we're seeing today, it's not about the Donbass. It's not about a minority. It is about a greed to subsume Ukraine into the Russian Federation, or indeed for President Putin to land grab in a way he modelled himself.
Right, but if you saw it coming a year ago, months ago. Shouldn't the West and NATO have been more prepared for this? Let me just read you what President Zelensky, who is in this city, we think somewhere, probably in his bunker somewhere, let me read you what he said this morning. He said, "We are defending our state alone. Like yesterday, the world's most powerful forces are watching from afar." As a military man, how does that make you feel?
Well, what it makes me feel is the same thing that many people in the West felt, which was what you are seeing on your cameras today is illogical. President Putin didn't need to do this. He didn't need to occupy, which he's doing right now, a sovereign country. None of it stacked up. None of the reasons why he would do it would stack up. A few of us felt that, again, I made a few comments the other day about President Putin. He's not doing something that's logical. He's doing something that is about his ego and his legacy. So, the West will act in accordance.
Sorry, I'm talking about the West, though, Mr. Wallace. I'm talking about the West's response. Regardless of any NATO articles or rules, is there not a moral responsibility on the West to protect a democratic state from a paranoid, autocratic dictator? Isn't that just basic humanity, and isn't that a moral mission?
Well, it absolutely is a moral mission, which is why we have taken the step of some of the toughest sanctions to be placed on Russia going in now.
It's not working. It's not working. The shells are coming in. The missiles are coming in.
Hang on, as you say, President... OK, so there are two other options, Mark, which is if you think President Putin is absolutely, irrational, tyrant, etc., and all those things that you have just said, which many of us do think he is in a position that is beyond logic, beyond respect of other sovereign countries, there are a number of ways to stop him or make it cost him. One is sanctions. One is to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, which is lethal aid, which we did alongside the United States quite early on, and training. We announced over a year ago that we would be selling ships to Ukraine with missiles that would allow them to defend their ports. We have done a lot. The third option, which is the option that I've been quite open about...
Just to interrupt on that one. Just to interrupt. How are you going to get any more military aid into this country if it is controlled by the Russians? They will control the airspace, they will control the borders, and they will control the sea borders. How do you get any more military help to help this? It's not going to happen, is it?
Well, I'm not going to tell you, with all due respect, how we're going to do these things, because that would put at risk the lives of the people that we are supporting, and indeed, other people. So look, what I would say is...
So the military could come in? So we could have the military coming in?
No, I didn't say military. I said we could support... I didn't say the military. Stop jumping to lots of things. I said it is perfectly possible on a country that is the size of Germany and France put together with 44 million people. Russia does not control the whole of Ukraine at all. Russia, as I said this morning, has failed in its day one objectives. Russia, with its Spetsnaz, its so-called elite, hasn't even been able to take an airport that it took yesterday. Russia has lost significant amounts of armour and people. The Ukrainians are fighting, and they are fighting brave. It is perfectly possible for countries around Europe and the world, in fact, I do agree with you, it is their moral duty to help the Ukraine. It is perfectly possible to continue to support Ukraine as we speak, as you are standing in Kiev, to make sure that we give them all the aid, whether it is non-lethal aid or where possible it is defensive lethal aid, to help them defend themselves. That is possible. Ukraine has a lot of fight in it. You've seen that over the night. President Putin is not getting it the way he wishes it to do, and he's currently got forces that far outnumber Ukraine. But it is possible. But I'm afraid I'm not going to go on national television and describe how we will help Ukraine, because to do that in a war footing scenario is to put people at risk.
Right. OK. This is an unprovoked and completely unjustifiable attack on a democratic nation. Does that, in your view, amount to a war crime?
Well, it certainly amounts to a breach of international law in anyone's definition. And what happens on the ground is the responsibility of the Russian Federation. We summoned the defence attaché to the Ministry of Defence yesterday. I made sure he was reminded of his obligations under the Geneva Convention. The track record of Russians in places like Chechnya is not good. But nevertheless, those commanders, whether they are senior or junior, will be held responsible. And in this day and age, the good news is we know who they are and we can find out who they are should they commit war crimes. And we will pursue them no matter what happens in Ukraine. The West will pursue them. The United Kingdom will pursue them. And President Putin, who has done this, he has to fail. Whether he fails militarily or whether he fails for the rest of his reign, so to speak, in Ukraine, he has to fail. He has to fail because he is fighting our values and he is fighting all the human rights that we stand for. And I don't know whether he'll fail in Ukraine. We will do everything we can to make sure he does. But if he doesn't, he needs to fail after that.
If you are going to track these people down and you're going to hold them to account, does that mean we will see President Putin in a war crimes court? Is that what you would like to see? And do you think that will ever happen?
If President Putin commits a war crime, then just as I do, if I were to commit a war crime, I should expect to be held to account. But, you know, what we're saying at the moment is...
Isn't this already a war crime?
Well, I'm not, I'm afraid, an international lawyer. I couldn't tell you the difference between breaking international law insofar as directing your forces to invade another country versus a war crime, e.g. things like genocide and indeed, torture and etc. So I wouldn't want to speculate the differences. What I would say is he's clearly broken international law. He's occupying or trying to occupy a sovereign country who made one mistake. In his eyes, their mistake in his eyes was not to choose the Kremlin as a way for their future. And that's all they have done. And as we see on our telly, President Putin's response to that is ultimate force, destruction, lots of civilian areas bombed. And we must all never forget that.
OK, and just finally, are you more convinced now than ever that Putin has gone full Tonto, as you put it, that he's irrational, lost his mind?
I certainly think what he is doing is deeply irrational. I certainly think he has gone full Tonto, if that's what what I said the other day and talking to some soldiers. No one else in their right mind would do what we are seeing on our telly screens today. No one else would impose their will on another sovereign country with all sorts of concocted conspiracies and very bizarre readings of history, unless somehow they were acting deeply irrationally. But that's no comfort to the people of Kiev. I spoke to my defence counterpart only a few minutes ago, and we spoke to them last night, myself and the Foreign Secretary. Our Prime Minister is going to speak to President Zelensky, and we will keep on going, supporting the people of Ukraine.
Ben Wallace, good of you to talk to us. Thank you very much. Right, let's see how Russia is attacking Ukraine from the north and the east and from the south. The offensive began in the Donbass region to the east, but there's now been over 200 attacks, according to the Ukrainian National Police Service. Let's look at the capital, Kiev, where I am, where the mayor, Vladimir Klitschko, says 3 people have been injured, with 1 in critical condition after a rocket attack on a residential building. There's also a battle going on for the Hostomel air base, while British intelligence claims it's highly likely Russia has captured the Chernobyl nuclear plant to the north of Kiev. What about Kharkiv, near the Russian border, where Russian attacks have focused on the Ukrainian military, including an airbase in nearby Kyiv. The mayor of Rivne in Ukraine's northwest says the city's airport faced missile strikes this morning, but no one was injured and no serious damage recorded there. Shelling has been reported in Lvov, and that's in the west and close to the Polish border, and it may soon find itself hosting refugees from other parts of this country. At least 18 people have been killed in a missile attack in Odessa in the southwest. It's a significant port complex, important for Russian forces to control. Ukrainian authorities said parts of the Kherson region along the Crimean coast are no longer under their control. Let's get the latest from around Ukraine now. Sky's John Sparks is in Ukraine's second biggest city of Kyiv, near the border with Russia. And John, just give me an idea. Day 2 of this operation has dawned. What are you seeing and what are you hearing?
Good morning, Mark. Yes, we believe that the Russian military is moving, as in Kiev, they are moving here in Kharkiv to surround the city, despite obstacles they will be facing from the weather this morning. We've still heard artillery fire just 5 minutes ago, the thud, thud, thud of incoming shells. So we all know they're here, and we all know that they're close by. The Ukrainian military is clearly ceding ground. There is a city about a 1.5-hour drive northwest of here called Sumy. We understand that the Russian military has now occupied that city and are erecting roadblocks on the highways leading to Kiev, although the Ukrainian president says that his forces are managing to stop the Russian military in most directions. But I think that Kiev is probably the main objective here. Intense fighting, as you know, overnight. Missile strikes, loud explosions. The air raid siren was sounding, and a Russian aircraft, I'm not sure if it was manned or unmanned, it was brought down by Ukrainian forces overnight, and the debris crashed into a residential building. And we're talking about, European capital city here of nearly 3 million people. I mean, absolutely terrifying for the residents there. We also heard overnight from the Ukrainian president, Zelensky. He released a short video message. I mean, this guy was acting in a comedy series until a few years ago. Now he is under the most extraordinary pressure. He was unshaven. He was in a T-shirt. He warned the Ukrainian public of saboteurs entering Kiev. He told them that he was the #1 target for the Russians, the #2 target being members of his family. And I think he is right. Vladimir Putin clearly wants to get rid of him and establish political control over Ukraine. And he said 137 people, Ukrainian citizens, either civilians or in the military, have been killed. They are killing people and turning peaceful cities into military targets, he said.
John Sparks in Kharkiv, just 25 or so miles from the Russian border. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, who joins me now from Moscow. And Dominic, I don't know whether you heard the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, just now, but he suggested that they would be tracking down and holding to account those responsible for war crimes here in Ukraine during this operation, also suggesting that Putin himself could be in the frame.
Yeah, and the West is trying to find a strategy that replaces its strategy of deterrence, which has failed. Deterrence and sanctions and military supply so far has done nothing to avert this extraordinary attack by Russia's president on a neighbour, an unprovoked attack, and an attack that undermines the entire security order that has kept us safe since the Second World War. And it shouldn't really come as any surprise. If you look at Putin's rhetoric, what he's been writing about recently, what he said on Monday, he clearly sees Ukraine as illegitimate, an artificial state, and therefore, although it's an independent sovereign state, he believes it has no right to exist effectively, and the Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and therefore he has a right to send in his troops and his forces effectively to reabsorb it into Russia, if that is his intention. And that is a direct challenge, a rejection of the principles that have kept us safe since the Second World War. Ukraine's not a NATO member, but what Putin is doing is trampling principles that NATO stands for, principles of independence, sovereignty, self-determination, freedom and democracy. And so far, what NATO has done and what the West has done and threatened to do is not deterring Vladimir Putin from going any further. And I think the worry for the West, obviously, you know, quite apart from what it means for security on the continent, is that if you look at his rhetoric, what he's been saying, it implies that the same kind of principles, the idea that that Ukraine's loss from the Soviet Empire was a grievance, applies also to the Baltic states and other former Soviet states. So if he's able to get away with what he's getting away with so far in Ukraine, it is a threat to those states as well. So the West is effectively wrestling with what to do next. This threat of war crimes being brought against Putin and commanders, the threat of more military supplies being sent into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian resistance against this operation. All that designed to try and avert what has happened. But it may take more than that for the West to reverse what Vladimir Putin is doing. In terms of the way the Russians are seeing this, Mark, it depends really on who you are and where you're getting your information from. If you're more educated and have access to the internet and are savvy in terms of accessing information, you are seeing a fuller picture of this multi-pronged, multi-front invasion that's going on in Ukraine. And that is leading to protests, hundreds, if not thousands of people coming out onto the streets. More than 50 cities saw protests last night, and 1,700 people were arrested. So that's testament, I think, to the strength of feeling amongst Russians, but also to the determination by the Russian government to trample any unrest. It does not want to have civil unrest undermining its position while it's waging a military operation in Ukraine. If you are less educated, poorer, and you rely on state media for your information, you're getting a very different picture. You're being told that this is still a very limited, special military operation. The Ministry of Defence here in Russia has said that this is it's only talking about a defensive operation protecting the renegade republics in the east, and also saying there's a limited operation from Crimea trying to unblock the Crimean Canal. So a surreal false version of events being put out by Russia's defence ministry while its military are conducting this extraordinary unprovoked attack on Ukraine.
Yeah, and just briefly, Dominic, there are suggestions today that things are not going entirely Russia's way in this operation, and that they're not meeting their objectives, according to Ben Wallace, their day one objectives certainly, and that the Ukrainians are putting up quite a fight.
Yeah, and Ben Wallace saying that 450 Russians have been killed, and it doesn't seem as though that they've taken any air bases. I think there was the reports that the Spetsnaz, Russian special forces, had taken Hostomel airport just outside of where you are in Kiev, but it seems the Ukrainians at least claiming that they've retaken that air base. And I think if the Russians had aimed to encircle Kiev by now, they've failed to do so. But as I say, none of that is being acknowledged on Russian state media in terms of what the Russians are being told at the moment. This is simply about defending those renegade republics in the east and launching some kind of limited operation from Crimea. We're going to hear from Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesperson, later in what could be a lengthy press conference, so we'll have to see whether she addresses any of that in her press conference. But obviously everything the Russian media says and the Russian government says should be treated with a lot of scepticism, given their track record of lying and deceiving in the past over the conflicts in Syria, Chechnya, a downing of the civilian airliner MH17 and so on.
Yeah, that is probably true. Dominic, thank you very much indeed. Well, Joe Biden has confirmed that the leaders of 30 NATO nations will meet on Friday as they come under increasing pressure to go even further than sanctions on Russia already announced. Let's speak to Greg Milam, who is in the United States for us. And Greg, I mean, I wonder what the Americans will think as the Russian forces close in on this capital city, and the plan seems to be to topple the government of a democratic state.
Yeah, I think that there is a sense of frustration, powerlessness. I think they know the world is watching the violence that's unfolding in Ukraine, and yet they can't offer that any sense of retribution, if you like, of fighting back militarily. That's clear. So we're left with sanctions, which can feel like a slow burn diplomatic response, which isn't enough for a lot of people, but they're left now trying to persuade all of us that is the right response. Joe Biden saying that these sanctions they've put in place will be devastating. They will turn Russia into a second-rate power in the short term and in the long term as well. Freezing assets, travel bans, financial hits, and in particular this export ban on things like semiconductors, which they think will hit the Russian military and the aviation sector, the aerospace sector. So they say those are significant. They're not taking that decision that Ukraine certainly wants them to take, which is to ban Russia from the SWIFT bank messaging system, which would be a big hit. But Joe Biden clearly saying that Europe doesn't want that to happen at the moment. But still on the table, the idea that Putin himself could be sanctioned. The issue there is finding out exactly what Vladimir Putin has by way of assets and where they are. They've been elusive over the years. It is rare also to sanction a head of state. So they say they're going for those close to him to increase the pressure on him, that by way of sanctions. And militarily, they have the options we keep hearing about. You mentioned that NATO heads of government and summit tomorrow morning, Washington time, that they believe bolstering NATO can be significant, but clearly not enough for a lot of people when they see and what the intelligence services here in the US see is going on the ground.
OK, Greg, thank you very much indeed. This is Sky News Breakfast from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, on day 2 of this Russian assault on Ukraine. Here are some of the latest developments this morning. In the past couple of hours, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced that Russian strikes on his country resumed this morning at 4 a.m. local time, aimed at both military and, he says, civilian targets. The president has ordered a full military mobilization to counter the Russian invasion. Men aged 18 to 60 have been banned from leaving this country. He says that so far 137 people have been killed, describing them as heroes. President Zelensky also stated the number of wounded as 316. And in the last few minutes, the UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace told me that the Russians have lost more than 450 personnel.
It's definitely our view that the Russians intend to invade the whole of Ukraine. The nonsense they were spouting about the Donbass, and it were, as ever, with a whole series of dishonest claims, are not the case, and that's why you've seen a number of columns of Russian army entering the city from the south, from the north, from Belarus even, and indeed from the separatist region. But, our assessment as of this morning is that Russia has not taken any of its major objectives. In fact, it is behind its hoped-for timetable. They've lost over 450 personnel.
Let's speak to Joe Pike, who's in Downing Street this morning for us. And Joe, what did you make of what Ben Wallace had to say? Some quite interesting stuff about war crimes and also this idea of still getting military resources into Ukraine.
Yes, Mark, we know that the UK government, because Boris Johnson has said so, want to provide more military support to Ukrainians and especially in the army. That would, we're told, be about body armour, night vision goggles, especially for the reservists called up, as well as shoulder-mounted anti-tank missile systems, quite small weapons which can be used in urban areas such as cities, perhaps the capital, and also can be used inside. Clearly, Mr. Wallace wanting to make it clear that he does still intend to get those weapons into Ukraine, even though, of course, he wouldn't explain quite how that's possible with Russia advancing so significantly. On war crimes, what Boris Johnson said in the Commons yesterday to MPs was that anyone who sends a Russian into a battle to kill innocent Ukrainians could be brought to court. The implication that Vladimir Putin could be guilty of war crimes. Mr. Wallace, not wanting to be too specific about what potential crime could have been committed, and I suppose it may take weeks for more detail to be given. Another interesting factor we should be aware of, in particular when Mr. Wallace talks about the number of Russian casualties, is that the UK government, I'm sure the Ukrainian government, will want to be positive about the efforts of the Ukrainian army, even though Western officials behind the scenes are pretty honest about how the two powers are not matched, and in particular how the Russian army are pretty battle-hardened from wars in Syria, from conflicts in Ukraine in 2014, and that has meant that they are clearly far more prepared than their Ukrainian counterparts, Mark.
Yeah, and just finally, I mean, confirming what he said the other day when he was talking to the the military officers that he does think that President Putin has gone full Tonto, as he said, and that he is acting irrationally with this.
Yeah, delusionally. He was trying to, I suppose, try and work out, as everyone is, what is going on inside Vladimir Putin's head. Kremlinology, of course. And I don't think he thinks, Mark, that what Vladimir Putin is doing is logical. And therefore, I think it's important for the UK government to highlight that problem. Vladimir Putin is unpredictable. Yes, they succeeded with intelligence officials in predicting what Vladimir Putin was going to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean they think what he is doing makes any sense, and it won't be very easy, of course, for the Russian president to maintain forces, maintain control of Ukraine if he does seize control in the coming weeks, in the medium and long term.
OK, Joe, thank you very much. Well, European leaders met until the early hours, agreeing a second package of sanctions on Moscow. Among the targets are Russia's banking and energy sectors, and they come on top of a wide range of measures announced by the United States. Our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons has this report.
There was anxiety and shock among Europe's leaders as they gathered in Brussels, and from those whose countries lie near Russia, a sense that the EU needed to show its teeth.
This is not only the war against Ukraine. This is a war against Europe, against democracy, against the international rules-based order. And I think we cannot take the luxury to be discussion club.
And they did decide on action on what they described as a massive package of sanctions.
It will have maximum impact on the Russian economy and the political elite, and it is built of 5 pillars. The first is the financial sector. Second, the energy sector. The third is the transport sector. Fourth are export controls and the ban of export financing. And finally, visa policy.
But Russia was not removed from this SWIFT banking system. That remains an option for the future. So caustic condemnation from the European Union, along with new sanctions and the prospect of more sanctions still to come. There is a sense of furious betrayal among many of these member states, and the ripples of that anger spread far beyond the orbit of European politicians. Leaders from NATO will discuss the situation in a virtual meeting. Ukraine is not a NATO member, but plenty of its neighbours are. And of course, NATO's most powerful country watches from across the Atlantic, nervous of repercussions.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
The looming problem is that Western diplomacy, backed by ever more severe sanctions, has now come up against Russia's use of military might. And that is a very dangerous cocktail. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Brussels.
Well, Sky's Laura Bundock is in Brussels for us. And Laura, I suppose the question is, what more can Europe do now? What more can the EU do?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we saw this sort of extended version of the sanctions package. I'd already said at the beginning of the week there was a prepared package in place and that it contained different components. This is obviously stage 2, and it does go considerably further. So when it comes to the financial markets, big restrictions on Russia being able to access capital markets, which means it'll restrict basically Russia's ability to borrow money. It'll also put a block on Russians making big deposits in EU banks. In terms of the transport sector, there's going to be a ban on the sale of aircraft and components, parts and equipment for aircraft. 3/4 of Russia's commercial fleet comes from either Europe, the US or Canada. So that will hit hard too. And limiting Russia's access to critical bits of technology, like things like semiconductors, which are present in all electronic devices. No move on SWIFT yet, though, that international international banking system that allows cross-border transactions to take place. There is a lot of disagreement behind the scenes, unity, but of course there are countries within the EU who have much closer trading links with Russia, who rely more heavily on Russian energy, and then disagreements too among those countries who border Russia as well, border rather Ukraine and Russia, and what it might all mean for them too. We've got this meeting of NATO leaders taking place virtually. We will hear from them before and after that meeting taking place at 2 o'clock to discuss further the defensive response there. And also going alongside the package of sanctions is this idea of humanitarian aid now being needed. So you've got the likes of Poland, Moldova, Hungary already saying they're expecting and are witnessing an influx of refugees coming in from Ukraine now.
Okay, Laura, thank you very much indeed. Well, I should just tell you, first of all, we're hearing increasing explosions, still some distance away, but also gunfire now. And this is over to the northeast. So these will be Russian forces coming in from northeast Ukraine or even Belarus, which there's a straight road down from Belarus to the capital, but there's quite a lot of fighting going on. It's, as I say, muffled and it's distant at the moment, but it does sound as though the Ukrainians are putting up quite a lot of resistance. But the capital itself, as you can see there, pretty quiet, some cars on the streets, but pretty calm, although there is a fear here now, or a reality here now, that the Russians are closing in. Well, the West has come swiftly together to impose economic sanctions on Russia, but some are critical of Germany's reaction to the crisis so far, despite halting the approval of key Russian gas pipeline Nord Stream 2. Many say German action has not gone far enough. Joining us now is Thomas Matusek, a former German ambassador to the UK and a senior advisor at the London consulting firm Flint. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. And it does seem, as I was just saying, that the Russians are closing in here and the intent is to remove a democratic government.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me. What I can say is that after the shock of yesterday, the Germans have woken up this morning with a terrible moral hangover. The whole of German Ostpolitik, our Eastern policy for the last 30 years, is in tatters. The motto, Wandel durch Handel, change by trade, which was at the basis of it. If you create economic interdependencies, it will finally lead to stabilization. It leads to the spread of the same values, liberal democracy, etc., did not come through. So what does Germany have to do now? I think the first thing is to make us less dependent on Russia, especially in the energy sector. And that means diversify our energy supplies. Second thing, we have to bring up our armed forces up to speed to modernize. They are at the moment in a terrible state, not able to present the deterrence which we need. We are very far away from spending the 2% of defense of our GDP on defense, which we're committed to in the NATO framework. And finally, and this is my personal opinion, what Putin did, he destroyed the NATO-Russia Act. So we are not any longer restrained from presenting permanent troops and even nuclear weapons in the eastern parts of NATO. And I think this is something very, very important to keep in mind in the future. And this last thing I would like to mention, this new German government is committed to make our restrictive arms export policy even more restrictive. So far, we have not sent any weapons to Ukraine for this and other reasons. And I think this also will be rethought. So bottom line is the Germans are still under shock. They see that Eastern policy for the last 30 years was absolutely wrong. It was a sign of political naivete, by the way, shared by people like me as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how this is changing Germany's view of their security requirements. What do you think of where NATO is in all this? Because they're being forced to, for good reasons, no doubt, being forced to stand on the sidelines and watch this, democratic state be overrun.
Well, directly, of course, NATO cannot intervene because Ukraine is not a NATO member. In hindsight, it would have been good in 2008 if they had become a NATO member, but that's not the case. No, what we have to do now is to reinforce the Eastern NATO states because there are no buffers anymore. Belarus is not a buffer anymore. Ukraine in the future will not a buffer. So we will have a situation which we had at the height of the Cold War, where Germany was a front line, and we see a new Iron Curtain which has come down now between Poland and Ukraine. And this is highly dangerous, especially as is a number of arms control and disarmament treaties do not exist anymore. Putin has established tactical and medium-range missiles and nuclear weapons in much greater quantities than even at the time when Helmut Schmidt proposed the dual decision on NATO for the INF Arms Control Treaty.
Okay. Thomas Madasek, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thousands of residents in the, not at all, thousands of residents in the Ukrainian city of Kyiv have spent the night in underground train stations and makeshift bomb shelters, fearing further missile attacks and air attacks by Russia. Yevgen Gorash, a Ukrainian national living in Glasgow, whose parents and friends are currently in Kyiv, and he is with us, and we're joined on the phone by Yevgen's friend, Alexei, who is speaking to us from Kyiv itself. And Alexei, if I can just start with you, I mean, where are you and are you safe?
Hello everyone. Right now, both me and my family are safe, but yesterday was a very tense day. As for about 3 hours we had to hide in the shelter. The shelter was actually the basement of a multi-storied house, and the situation was quite difficult. Fortunately, we still have electricity and internet connection, but it's very poor. The speed is very low. And yesterday's morning started with missile attacks and perhaps artillery shelling at about 5 o'clock in the morning. So we spent the entire day monitoring the news, and also our underground stations there. All of them were used as shelters for people.
It must have been absolutely terrifying for you and your family.
Actually, it was because for the first time in our lives we heard artillery shelling, and we heard tank shots that were fired like 4 to 5 kilometers away. But all of us are safe now, and fortunately the situation is more or less controlled.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased to hear that. And Yevgen, what do you make of what is happening right now to your country?
Good morning, everyone. Hi, Alexei. I'm happy to hear from you as always. I just had a phone conversation with my parents in Kharkiv, and I just confirmed with them as previous morning that they are safe and alive. They confirmed that there are just a few people on the streets, and they are just trying to get basic food from shops. And we don't know really what to expect from this day. From my parents, I've heard that Kharkiv resists, and as Alexei mentioned, the situation is under control, but nobody knows when Russian tanks decide to go ahead again and cross the the city borders. Yeah, so I'm very much worried, and I was all the time on talks with my parents just yesterday, and I spent the whole day on George Square with my Ukrainian friends on George Square in Glasgow Centre, and we received massive support from local people, from journalists, massive attention from journalists and MPs, and that's going to be our day today as well. We'll be on George Square the whole day.
Okay, and Alexei, if you're still with us, today is another day, and it looks as if, certainly here in Kiev, the Russian forces are getting closer. Do you fear what lies ahead in the next hours and days?
Well, it is difficult to predict exactly what will happen in the next few days. But I would say that this day and the following night will be decisive, because Kharkiv still resists, and we receive news that now the main target of the Russian forces is Kyiv. So basically what they want to do is to behead the country by taking our president and our government prisoners, or maybe executing them. And as Yevhen mentioned, we have to look for some food supplies. Food is still available, and fresh water is still available, and we hope that this situation will last. But as mentioned, Ukraine resists, and this day and the following night will show what will be the outcome.
And just finally, Alexei, would you stay in Ukraine if it was a government not elected by the people?
You see, if you take the example of the of the former Soviet Union countries, if you speak about Belarus or Kazakhstan or Russia, they don't have any presidential elections anymore, and they don't have any freedom of speech. Because I cannot blame all of Russian people about this invasion. The main people who are, let's say, who can be the decision makers are Putin and his close connections, people who are close to him. Ukraine is like, the last island, small island of democracy and freedom. And if we fall, then Putin's dream of creating, or let's say recreating, the Soviet Union in its second version will be very close to completion. So what I would like to ask is to support us and to impose as severe sanctions as possible. I mean real sanctions, not just words, but some real sanctions that would really hurt Putin and his close associates.
Okay, Alexei, you try and stay safe as best you can, and Yevgen also, thank you both very much indeed. Well, the Champions League final in May was due to be held in the Gazprom Arena in St. Petersburg, but it will be moved now following Russia's invasion of this country. Jackie Beltrao is joining me now, and I mean, in the circumstances, no great surprise.
No great surprise. There is an emergency meeting this morning of the UEFA Executive Committee, and they will confirm what you have just said, that they will strip St. Petersburg of the Champions League final. There's 27 members of that committee will be in on this meeting. One of them is a Russian, Alexander Dukov. He is also the chief executive of Gazprom. They are a huge sponsor of UEFA, not to mention this arena. They pump in £33 million per season. UEFA now under a lot of pressure to sever ties with Gazprom. Yesterday, the German club Schalke took Gazprom off the front of their shirts. That's their club sponsor, no longer. There's big questions over Aeroflot, who is a sponsor of Manchester United. Will they sever ties with them now? We don't know which city is going to be given the Champions League final. That is still under discussion, but it will be confirmed at 9 o'clock. Big questions as well for FIFA today, because Russia are still in the playoffs for the World Cup. They're in a group with 3 other teams, Poland, the Czech Republic and Sweden. And those 3 teams have written a letter to FIFA yesterday and said, we will not play those playoff matches in Russia. You must change the venue. At the minute, they haven't responded, but they are under pressure to respond. And of course, questions over Scotland's playoff match. They will be playing Ukraine at Hampden Park. Obviously, Ukrainian football has been suspended, so that now in doubt.
Jackie, thank you very much. Still to come on Sky News Breakfast, we'll have all the latest live from Kiev as Ukrainian forces battle against the Russian invasion of their country. We here in central Kiev are hearing explosions getting closer to this city. We're also hearing gunfire. But we're told the Ukrainian forces are putting up resistance, and their soldiers, we're told, according to the military here, are putting up a real fight.